The Lord be with you. Let us pray. O Lord, help us to remember that we have only one true port, heaven. Help us never to suffer shipwreck on our journey thither, nor to put our souls in danger of sin, which is the only true death. Have mercy on our land and on our homes, and make us to know and love this faith ever more and more. Through Jesus Christ, thy Son, our Lord, who liveth and reigneth with thee in the unity of the Holy Ghost, ever one God, world without end. Amen. I want to talk today about some Celtic saints, and I'm not going to cover all of the Celtic areas, but I am going to address a few today and a few in the future. Anyway, today I want to talk about the saints Bridget, Columba of Iona, Kevin of Glendalough, and Brendon the Navigator. I've chosen Brendon the Navigator on purpose because he's the one you're most likely to reject, and I want to show you why you shouldn't. Anyway, when studying Celtic saints, one of the things we need to do is to recognize how they use their culture to spring as a springboard into the culture of eternity. And I think maybe it's my bias showing, but I think that they're some of the best examples of how this is done. And I want to just touch on a few because we'll refer to them sort of as we do these bios. The Celtic missionaries, those who went into Celtic and even some non-Celtic, but those who went into Ireland and Scotland and Wales, and by that I mean those areas mainly, used the culture as a starting point for their missionizing. That is, they learned what the culture taught and they used it, but they didn't stop right there or try to bless the culture. They tried to take them beyond it. So let me show you how one of the ways they did it. The Druids were held in high esteem among the Celtic peoples. They were religious leaders, but they were more than that. Some people think they were only priests, but they were priests, musicians, poets, storytellers. The history of the people was passed on through the storytellers, and they were called Druids. And so the people feared the Druids. They might ignore them, but they wouldn't hurt them. So the Romans didn't fear religious types at all. They didn't mind killing a few of them. It's just no big deal. Even if it made the gods mad, So the Celts were not like that. In fact, Ireland claims that it has no martyrs. And my examination of its history shows that probably is true. I don't know about Wales and Scotland. I haven't looked. But Ireland may very well be the only European nation which one can find no martyrs in its saints collections. And this is due to the fact that the people feared the Druids, and the missionaries, as they went into Ireland primarily, but also into the other the Celtic areas like Wales and Scotland, followed the Druid tonsure. Remember tonsure, the trimming of the hair, which was common in Orthodoxy right from the beginning, but it took different shapes and forms in different places. And so the Celts would tonsure. The non-Christian Druids would tonsure the head from ear to ear and show their foreheads. So this whole front of the head would be shaven. And so they did it because that was the seat of wisdom in the human being. And the Druid had wisdom that no one else had, whatever he did. And so that was a sign of when you saw that person coming with that tonsure, wow, I better pay heed. So the Celts, using the concept of tonsure, began to tonsure themselves that way, so that when they went into areas where the pagan Celts lived, they were automatically feared and revered and treated with respect and heeded even when they weren't heeded. Another point is Celtic philosophy. So they used the concept of the Druids to their advantage, the missionaries did. Celtic philosophy. Of course, among the Celts, the circle was the symbol of eternity and divinity. Now, a lot of religions of the world use this circle, so it's not anything uncommon. But the Celts went into the missionaries and went into these areas, and they talk about Jesus. And what's that? That's the sign of Christ, right? So in order to work this out to get people's attention, they used their philosophy, especially the symbol of eternity, and imposed it on the cross. So that's called, what that says is Christ is God. Christ is eternal, the essence of Christian faith. Now, there are lots of other ways in which they use these things. I'm just giving you simple ones. Legends, that is, their stories. And by the way, if you read in the books of the church, you're going to have the saints' lives are going to be listed as legends. In the breviary, in matins, monastic matins of the breviary, the saints' lives are called legends. And that doesn't, for us, a legend is something that's not true. And that itself is not true. Myth is also a word we misuse. We think myth means something that has no basis in fact, but that is not true either. So the Celts told us stories in a certain literary style, and it was highly exaggerated and almost unbelievable. Almost unbelievable. Now, here's the thing. We need to get this because we'll never understand some of these stories. And when I talk to you about St. Brendon, you'll see why. We'll never understand some of these stories until we understand this fact. And they're not just the Celtic culture was like this. There were many cultures like this where people exaggerated the stories in order to make a point. So when we go back, reading the lives of the saints and we hear these unbelievable tales, we can't discount it just because it doesn't fit our sense of factual evidence. We cannot do that. So when you read 3 bios of the same person from 3 different areas of the world and you get 3 different stories, don't discount 2 out of the 3 or all 3 because they're different. Don't do that. It doesn't mean we accept it as blanket truth, but still we don't reject carelessly. Well, the Celts told their Bible stories and the stories of their saints the same way. They used the literary style to which the people were accustomed in order to get their attention, and it worked. Lastly, the calendar. The Celtic calendar was divided into 4 seasons. Does that sound familiar? And they were started on specific days. 1st of February, which was called Imbolc in the ancient Irish language. The 1st of May, which was called Bealtaine. The 1st of August, which was known as Lunasa, and the 1st of November, which was Samhain, not Samhain, people, Samhain. And so those were the 4 major seasons. And in those times, it was believed that the space between this world and the next was reduced. And actually, there was communication, especially on November 1st, with the other world and the others, as they called them. So the Celts came in, the missionaries, and they didn't say, listen, you guys are a bunch of pagans, you got to get rid of all this stuff. No more of these celebrations. They simply replaced them with saints' days. So February 1st, they inserted St. Bridget. May 1st, they left it open, although St. Philip and James wound up being in there somewhere. I left it open because usually it fell in the Paschal octave or the Pentecost octave, and even if they'd had a feast, it would have gotten moved. So, because those are special times. August, St. Peter's Chains. And November 1st, All Saints, which in the Eastern Rite is celebrated in the spring. What, the octave of Pentecost or Pascha? It's Pentecost, isn't it? Saturday after Pentecost. The Saturday after Pentecost. So they replaced it. In England, All Saints is called All Hallows Day. And the vigil, the time before it starts, vigils are big in the Western tradition. The vigil was called the Eve, so All Hallows Eve. In slang English, would have said Hallow Ian. You get the word? You see where it came from? And that's why Christians have a problem with it, not to get rid of it, but to transform it. And it's not being transformed. So in any case, that's how they use the legends. You need to remember that when you start thinking, well, these stories are ridiculous. All of them, not just the Celtic stories, but all the cultures. So let's look at St. Bridget of Ireland, February 1. She lived from 453 to 524, we think. Her father was a pagan chieftain. Her mother was a Christian slave. Thus, she was born into slavery. As a child, she grew toward adulthood. As she grew toward adulthood, she assumed the faith of her mother. That is, as a child, a young person, she assumed the faith of her mother, who was Christian, and she committed herself to Christ. this commitment led her to follow the admonitions about taking care of the poor. So she repeatedly gave away her master's goods to the poor. And he got sick and tired of it, so he set her free. In her 30s, desiring a deeper life, she decided to take up the monastic mantle, which was really popular in Ireland, at least, if not in Scotland and Wales as well. The monastic mantle was seen as the deepest form of Christian living. And so she wanted to go as deep as one could go. She formed the first religious community for women in Ireland. From this community, she traveled much of Ireland, establishing monasteries and communities everywhere she went. If you go to Ireland today, St. Patrick's places are like that too. He did the same thing. She never ceased her support of the poor as she was doing this, always giving away everything that she had. She's said to have had an extensive medical knowledge as well as the gift of healing. So she had worldly knowledge and the gift of healing. Her sanctity was to become famous, and many traversed Ireland to meet her. So many were the conversions that actually a bishop was assigned to perform episcopal services for her. In Ireland, in the Celtic lands of the early centuries AD, bishops and priests were seen as subsidiary to abbots and abbesses. So clergy were functionaries only. They were the ones who did the sacramental stuff. And if you really wanted the deeper life, you went to an abbot. So when the diocese was not built around the bishop's chair, but around the monastic house, the abbot's house. It took them centuries and centuries to take care of that issue. St. Bridget is remembered in Ireland as the patron of mercy and pity. She's also considered one of the patron saints of the Irish people. If you speak to the Irish people, it's St. Patrick and Bridget together. The two are the top two. She's fondly entitled the Mary of the Gale among the Irish people. She reposed sometime in the year 524. Now, if you look at her example, she was reared in the Christian faith. She was a Christian from her earliest years. We don't even know when, even though she didn't own it until she was in her teens. So conceivably, she could be a patron saint of a youth, of a teenager, of an adult. She desired the deeper life. That's the example of all these people. They want more. There's more to this than just being religious. And she lived that desire in her asceticism, in her charitable works, in her evangelism, and in her sense of immaterialism, willfully traveling around in order to share that with others. Now, and St. Bridget. St. Columba of Iona, an abbot who lived from 521 to 597. Iona is in Scotland, so he's considered a Scottish saint, although he was actually born in Ireland. He was of royal Irish heritage, so in spite of what the political statements are saying, seeming to turn us against rich people, you have saints here who are from rich families, relatively speaking. We may have more than they, which would make us richer than they were. So we have to be careful when we start throwing stones. God can touch anyone's heart in any circumstance. So he was of royal Irish lineage and was baptized at an early age. According to Celtic custom, and this is another way in which the Celts transformed the culture, he was given to St. Finian to care for and educate him. Among the Celts, at least in Ireland, it was customary when a male child was between the ages of 2 and 7 to give him to an uncle to take care, for the uncle to bring him up and to teach him and train him. So what the Celts did was they took that and they gave them into the care of some holy individual, a monk or a nun. And so you find a lot of this people that are brought up in the faith, brought up with this situation, brought up by saints. And when we later, looking back, call them saints. So he was given to St. Finian to care for him and educate him. By the way, if you watch Braveheart, remember the father gets killed and William Wallace is put into the care of his uncle, Argyle. But that's taking that truth of the story and then distorting it. According to historical data, his father probably didn't die in battle like that and lived to a ripe old age. So, but he still would have been given to an uncle to care for and brought up. And that part's captured in the story. So in any case, he's been described, St. Columba is described, and I quote, a striking figure of great stature and athletic build with a voice so loud and melodious it could be heard a mile off. End of quote. When he came of age, he engaged his earliest adult years evangelizing pagans and establishing monasteries, that is, places where the deeper life was taught. That was important to him. Now here's a story that's attributed to him, and I think this is important for us. During his lifetime, a war broke out between his clan and another. He helped instigate the contention, the result being that some 3,000 men are said to have lost their lives. It's probably an exaggeration, but it doesn't make any difference. After the struggle, a synod was held among the local Christians to address the impact of this event in the lives of the area people. It was believed that the responsibility for these deaths and the ensuing instruction were due to Columba's urging. Remember, he had a loud voice that could be heard. The synod held him responsible and assigned him a penance. And here I have to say, penance does not mean punishment. That's what we Americans errantly think. It means an assignment, a spiritual assignment. And so when you see on TV in the movies, the priest hears a confession, the Catholic priest, and he says, say 5 Hail Marys and 10 Our Fathers. And we're going, what kind of punishment is that? It's not a punishment. It's the beginning.
Prescription.
It's a prescription, yeah. Exactly. So his prescription was to be exiled from Ireland for his life and to spend the remainder of his days saving as many as were lost in the struggle. Wow. Talk about turning someone's attention around. That was a costly one. In 563, at roughly the age of 42, he embarked on the journey of this penance. He left Ireland with 12 companions, finally landing on the island of Iona in Scotland. It's off the coast of Scotland on the west coast. And so the two islands that are big, Lindisfarne on the east coast and Iona on the west. The Celts were big on islands, whereas the desert monastics like the desert, and the Russians like the forests, the Irish and the Celts like the islands, the barren islands. In fact, the Irish jokingly call it the desert in the ocean. So in any case, he founded Iona. From there, he engaged in continuous missionary work, with Iona being his headquarters of sorts. From there, he gave spiritual direction to many, and at that location, he strove to live the Christian life. A certain saint named Adamnan, Celtic saint, describes him thus, and I quote, he had the face of an angel, he was of an excellent nature, polished in his speech, holy in deed, great in counsel. He never let a single hour pass without engaging in prayer or reading or writing. He endured the hardships of fasting and vigils without permission by day and by night. In the midst of all his toils, he appeared loving unto all, serene and holy, rejoicing in the joy of the Holy Spirit in his inmost heart. End of quote. Now, another source describes him this way, and you need to hear this. Of all quote, of all qualities, gentleness was precisely the one in which Columba failed the most. End of quote. See, we don't want to hear that the saints had flaws, but when we read about them, we can witness to that, can't we? Because we all know what it means to struggle with ourselves. And so when we hear somebody like this, there's hope for us no matter what. This guy his dialogue led to the deaths of over 3,000 men. Maybe even more, maybe less, who knows? So that's his flaw, and he'll live with the consequences of that for the rest of his life, even in his own heart, if nothing else. In 597, at roughly the age of 76, having fulfilled the terms of his penance, he discerned his impending death. He spent his last night praying in the church at Iona. When the monks arrived for matins, they found him near death, prostrate before the altar. He died there shortly after the year was 597. So he was brought up in the faith, given to a saint career on the edges. It's okay to be rough around the edge as long as we're not willing to stay there and allow God to do something about it. Willing to receive and fulfill his penance. He didn't say, well, by golly, it's not my fault. I'm not doing what you tell me. That is not the spirit of Christ. And that is not the spirit of a saint. He always maintained his spiritual discipline, no matter what it cost him. Hence, He's called a saint, Saint Columba of Iona. Now, we'll talk about another one that you only hear about roughly if you take a tour of Ireland, because he's big on the tourist tour. And that's Kevin of Glendalough. I told you a story a long time ago about one Eastern Rite bishop when I was thinking about coming into Orthodoxy, and it mentioned Saint. Well, it was Saint Kevin. He'd never heard of him before. He was born in the Irish province of Leinster in 498. Leinster is in the area around Dublin. His parents were of Irish royalty. See, again, the rich. And were also Christians. They had brought him up in the faith, he being baptized as an infant by one St. Cronin. It's said that his name Kevin was given by an angel, though the Irish cannot seem to agree what it means. Well-beloved, beautiful, shining birth, and handsome are three possibilities. So could be all, could be none. Who cares, right? So in any case, he's one of 5 children, as was customary among the Irish to send the sons to be reared by relatives. He was sent to a monastery rather than to a saint, where the monks were expected to complete his emotional and intellectual education. He came to treasure the monastic life because of that, and was to remain there for many years, serving the community and praying diligently. About the age of 20, it was said, he was ordained a priest, so a functionary. But he never really did stay there. And in fact, later canons, I think, raised the age to ordination to the priesthood to 30. So isn't that right? It's 30. Bishops are at 35, something like that. There's wisdom in that, but that wasn't the case early on, and the Celts probably would have ignored that anyway. And there's always economia, the bishop's prerogative to go around the rules. Shortly thereafter, he left the monastery to pursue the solitary life. He retired to the mountains of an area called Glendalough, which means the Valley of the Lakes, and he spent 7 years alone in the mountains around the valley in prayer. It's said that he spent many nights in constant vigil, and on many occasions, you'll read this about a lot of Celtic saints, he would stand in the lake up to his waist, reciting the daily offices. So we read about that a lot, standing up, sometimes up to their neck in water. And the lakes there and the rivers are cold all year long. So it never warms up like here in Texas, when you can step in the water and it's 85 degrees, and it's been that way all summer. It doesn't warm up. It's nice and cold, and that was the idea of doing that. And they would also, instead of the orans position, which is what the prayer posture from the Old Testament, it's a Semitic prayer posture with the hands like this to God. Instead, the Celts would put themselves in the form of a cross. So many of them would be said to be standing in the water like this, praying their prayers from memory, because they were required to learn the psalm by heart. Don't come into church and do this.
We don't have enough space.
No, we don't. No, we punching each other in the face, and your Christianity will really be tested. Let me tell you. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Do it in your swimming pool. That's right. Okay, his diet consisted of herbs, nuts, and water. He slept on flagstones with a rock for a pillow, and he clothed himself in animal skins. It was his great joy to spend his days in uninterrupted prayer and deny himself the pleasures of life, but this was not to be forever. After 7 years, an angel appeared to him and instructed him to leave the mountains, establish a monastery and a retreat center in the valley below. And so if you go to Ireland today and you go to Glendalough, that's where you'll go. What he established down in the valley. At first, he was extremely reluctant, but he agreed, and he was to remain in the monastery of Glendalough for the remainder of his life. His life was filled with miracles. It's said that he was also extremely humble and concerned for the poor. There's a story told about one poor family that was starving nearby. And so he gave 7 lambs from their flock, the monastery's flock, 7 best lambs to this family to sustain them for a period of time. And one of the monks, probably the equivalent to what we now call a prior in the Western tradition, said, "Look, you're depleting the flock. We're not going to have enough food to take care of us." And St. Kevin's response was, "God will provide." Well, they went out the next day and they counted the lambs, and all the number were there. So there weren't 7 missing. So what that all means is anyone's guess. Could be probably most likely a miracle. Anyway, he had a special relationship with nature, not unlike that of St. Seraphim of Sarov and the Catholic St. Francis of Assisi. Every year during Lent, he would retire from the monastery and spend his Lenten discipline in solitude at the mountain place where he had been earlier. After a life devoted to prayer, good works, and spiritual instruction of the faithful, he died around 618 at the tender age of 120. I forgot to give you his dates. They were 498 to 618, but that would confound you. You'd say, wait a minute, your numbers are not right. Remember, I did St. Paul the Simple and St. Anthony. 100 years was not uncommon for monks. He was reared in the faith by monks. He was of noble background. He was given monastic Christian exposure at an early age, and he lived it for 90 years. 90 years. Most of us can't even imagine living the Christian life for 50 years, let alone 90. So now, lastly, my favorite in this story is St. Brendon of Clonfert, also known as St. Brendon the Navigator. 484 to 577. You'll see why I like this guy. He was born in the west of Ireland near Tralee, about 484. As a child, he was reared by Christian parents, baptized as an infant, and brought up by St. Ida for 5 years. It's said that he was priested, then took monastic vows. He may have been around 30 years of age when that occurred. We don't know. Sometime shortly after he was ordained, he became interested in investigating what the pagan Celts of Ireland called the many-splendored land to the west, across the sea. Many-splendored land was sometimes understood as paradise. So don't go looking for paradise. God closed the way to paradise. So no matter what we think, we can't go looking for it. Well, he did. So with a handful of supporters, fellow monks, he built a curragh, an Irish canoe, which is somewhat larger than a canoe as we understand one, and sailed west. A curragh was made of wood framing with leather, oiled leather around it. So imagine going out in the Atlantic Ocean in a boat of oiled leather. I'm sorry, you're not getting me to try that. So his journey is described in a medieval story called the Navigatio in Latin. And when you read it, you go, this is so preposterous as not to be real. It can't be real. And so it is said that on his journey, he landed on North American soil, thus becoming the first European to do so, if it's true, 300 years before Leif Erikson, 800 years before Columbus. But according to the anthropologists, several thousand years after the Asians landed here and became the American Indians. So in any case, just for your information, we'd say that's a preposterous story. Yeah, right. Anyway, when he returned to Ireland, when he found out that wasn't the many splendor, it wasn't heaven on earth, it was just another continent, another piece of land with peoples in it, he came back, returned to Ireland, spent the remainder of his days living the ascetic life, evangelizing and founding monasteries. He lived in a stone cell, fasted until 3 p.m. His diet consisted of vegetables, and he continually strove to increase his education, becoming fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, which was not uncommon at that time frame. Sometime around 559, he had founded the monastery of Clonfert, for which he is famous. There were some 3,000 monks there. Can you imagine running that many people? And the rule of community is said to have been dictated by an angel. Late in his life, he again developed the desire to wander and is said to have traveled to Scotland and Wales and even to the Middle East in order to spread the faith. He reposed in 577. Now, in this story of the Navigatio, he sails up the west coast of Ireland, up toward Iceland and Greenland, and over and lands in somewhere in the North Americas. Doesn't say where. So in each of along this journey, the writer describes these outlandish things that he has seen. And you go, surely this is not possible. This is ridiculous. So the first thing one wants to do when he reads the Navigatio is discount the whole. I remember I used to ask, what is this guy doing on the calendar of the church? Well, in the 1970s, I think it was 1979, an English, this gives substance to the whole thing. An Englishman named Tim Severin decided to, and you can read about him online, he apparently did a number of things like this, but he decided to see if the story was possible. So he set out to learn how to build a curragh, find out what a curragh was made like in a time of St. Brendon, not today's version of it, but St. Brendan's time. Then find out what it would take to make it, and then actually do it. And he did. And the book is well worth reading. It's called The Brendon Voyage. We don't have it in the library, but it's a worthy read, I think. It's a little bit laborious. Once the journey begins, it gets a little laborious. But it's got miracles in it. He doesn't even ascribe to miracles because he's a secularist. But what he proves in the story is that it is a possible scenario, and that there are natural explanations for some of the things that are said in the Navigatio. And remember the literary tendency of Celtic peoples to exaggerate in order to make a point. So he brings that out in the story, and you're going, wow. And he actually set out in a curragh made with oiled leather and sailed up the coast and landed in Newfoundland, which is what the people there claim. So Leif Erikson said to have landed up there too in that area. So he landed there, and there are some sources that say he went as far south down the coast of North America, down as far as the Bahamas. But I don't know about that one. That may not be I can't remember whether that's in the Navigatio, but in any case, if you look at St. Brendan, there's no mention of his heritage. And that's why he's called the Navigator, by the way, the one who got in the boat and went. And he was a Christian from his youth. He lived the ascetic life despite his rough edges, and his rough edges were to believe, as if they were true, the Celtic stories. In any case, if we look at all these stories, these four together, then I put here on the board just sort of a summary. And that is, they loved their culture, but they transcended it. And they understood their culture, but they transcended it. We may love our culture. We are people of our culture, but our culture of the church transcends this thing. So we can be here and be anywhere in the world with other Christians, real, true Christians, and we're all transcending our cultures and entering into the culture of eternity. Each of these was a Christian from his youth. So lifelong, and starting at an early age. We don't have to have babies becoming Christians. There may be stories of that too, but they were Christians from their youngest ages. So an old saint is also a saint of the young if he's been a Christian all his life. So each desired a deeper life, more. And not we dictate what the more is, because that's idolatry, but we allow God to dictate it, and we enter into eternity where we get more. Unto the ages of ages. Several were rough around the edges. Here's hope for some of us. I remember years ago when early on after I got serious about my Christianity, I met an old friend, and he'd been a thug when he'd been in high school. I mean, he used to beat people up, and the police knew him very well. He'd been arrested that many times. And we had this short discussion, and he said, "What have you been doing with yourself?" And I explained what I'd done, how I'd come to Christ and given myself to Christ. And he said, I still remember this as clear as, he said, "It's too late for me." I've never forgotten that in my life. Never forgotten it. It's never too late for any of us. And nothing is so bad that God cannot forgive it. So these people were rough around the edges. I love some of the, St. Paul was a murderer, and St. Peter denied Christ. So these were the two of the chiefs of the apostles. This parish is named after those people. In the Western Rite, when you commemorate one, you have to commemorate the other. So this parish is named after someone who betrayed Christ. That's great. Is that what we follow? Well, what did he do with it? They were willing to receive penance, that is direction. Who are you to tell me what to do? I know better. Good luck. Let's see if in 50 years you're satisfied. And what a waste of time. I look back and I think, and I've been at this now on this journey for, well, since 1, so that's what? I was 21, so 50 years almost 50 years, and I still feel like I wasted the first 20 years of my life. Wasted. So they maintained their spiritual disciplines throughout their lives, and they kept going deeper and deeper with it. And it was lifelong. The whole journey was lifelong. Remember these things, and we're applying all of this together to get what we need to know about the Christian life and what we learn from these people. And each one of them will give us bits and pieces of this. We can see from their examples.